The late afternoon sun painted the city park in warm, golden hues. Ancient oak trees stretched their mighty branches overhead, casting dancing shadows across the worn pathways below. Children's laughter echoed from nearby playgrounds, while joggers moved steadily along the winding trails. The gentle hum of traffic from the busy avenue created a familiar urban symphony that had become the park's constant companion. Near the center of this peaceful scene sat a weathered wooden bench beside a small stone fountain. The water trickled softly, creating ripples that caught the fading sunlight. On this bench sat an elderly black man whose cloudy eyes gazed unseeing into the distance. His weathered hands, marked by decades of hard work and struggle, rested gently on a small paper bag filled with stale breadcrumbs. This was Samuel Washington, 73 years old, a man who had lost his sight to diabetes 5 years earlier. Every afternoon at precisely 4 o'clock, he made his careful way to this exact spot. His worn wooden cane tapped a familiar rhythm on the pavement as he navigated the paths he had memorized through countless visits. This bench had become his sanctuary, his connection to a world that often seemed to forget he existed. With practiced movements, Samuel reached into his bag and pulled out small pieces of bread. He scattered them on the ground before him, and immediately the air filled with the soft flutter of wings. Pigeons descended in a graceful dance, their cooing voices creating a gentle chorus that brought warmth to Samuel's heart. Though he could not see their gray and white feathers or watch them pecking at the crumbs, he could hear every movement, every satisfied chirp. "There you go, my friends," Samuel whispered softly, his voice carrying the weight of loneliness and the comfort of routine. "I know you've been waiting for me. We all need someone to care about us, don't we?" The pigeons responded with enthusiastic fluttering, crowding closer to his feet. Some grew bold enough to perch on the edge of the bench, their tiny claws scratching against the wood. Samuel smiled at their presence. In a world that had grown increasingly cold and indifferent, these simple creatures offered him something precious. They needed him, and he needed them. This daily ritual had become more than just feeding birds. For Samuel, it represented dignity, purpose, and connection. After losing his sight, after losing his job at the factory where he had worked for 30 years, after losing his wife to cancer just 2 years prior, these moments with the pigeons reminded him that his life still had meaning. The fountain continued its gentle bubbling, and Samuel tilted his head to listen to the familiar sounds around him. He could identify regular joggers by their footstep patterns, recognize children by their excited voices, and distinguish between different types of birds by their calls. His world had become one of sound, touch, and memory, but it was still rich with life. As he continued feeding the pigeons, Samuel's mind wandered to earlier times. He remembered bringing his grandson to this very park 15 years ago, pushing him on the swings that still creaked nearby. He remembered holding his wife's hand on this bench during her final months, watching sunsets he could still see then. Those memories felt both distant and immediate, like photographs he could touch but no longer view. The bread bag was nearly empty now, but Samuel rationed the remaining crumbs carefully. He had learned to make his small pension stretch, and even this simple pleasure required planning. The pigeons seemed to sense the approaching end of their feast and crowded closer, their movements becoming more urgent. "Easy now," Samuel chuckled softly. "There's enough for everyone. We share what we have, right? That's what decent people do." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves above him, carrying the scent of flowering trees and the distant aroma of someone's barbecue. Samuel breathed deeply, savoring these simple pleasures that had become so much more meaningful since his world had grown dark. He had learned to find joy in smaller things: the warmth of sunlight on his face, the sound of children playing, the trust of these wild birds who had accepted him as part of their daily routine. But even in these peaceful moments, Samuel carried the weight of a lifetime spent facing prejudice and hardship. He had grown up in the South during segregation, had fought for civil rights as a young man, and had worked twice as hard as his white colleagues just to earn half the recognition. Now, in his elderly years with his disability, he faced new forms of discrimination, the subtle kind that came with being invisible, being dismissed, being seen as a burden rather than a human being with dignity and worth. The last crumbs fell from his fingers, and the pigeons pecked eagerly at the ground around his feet. Samuel sat quietly, listening to their satisfied sounds, feeling grateful for this moment of peace. He had no way of knowing that in just a few minutes, this tranquil scene would explode into violence and hatred, but also into an act of heroism that would change everything. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of human cruelty and human compassion, all centered around one elderly man who simply wanted to feed the birds. The peaceful atmosphere shattered like glass hitting concrete. Heavy footsteps approached from behind Samuel's bench, each step deliberate and aggressive. The rhythmic thud of boots on pavement wasn't the casual gait of a park visitor or the steady pace of a jogger. This was the march of someone looking for trouble, someone whose very presence seemed to darken the golden afternoon light. Officer Derek Mitchell had been having what he called one of those days. 3 complaints filed against him in the past month, a reprimand from his captain, and a divorce that was draining his bank account. At 38 years old, he had spent 15 years on the force, and 15 years of accumulated bitterness had turned him into exactly the kind of cop that gave all police officers a bad name. His badge had become a weapon, his uniform a shield for his prejudices. The pigeons sensed the change in atmosphere immediately. Their cooing grew nervous, agitated. Several took flight, their wings beating frantically as they sought safety in the nearby trees. Samuel felt their departure like a physical loss, the sudden absence of their gentle sounds leaving an ominous silence. "Hey!" Officer Mitchell's voice cut through the air like a blade. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Samuel turned his head toward the sound, his cloudy eyes blinking in confusion. His weathered hands instinctively gripped his walking cane tighter. "I'm sorry, officer. I'm just feeding the pigeons. I come here every day. There's no rule against it." Mitchell stepped closer, his leather belt creaking as his hand brushed against the various weapons hanging from it. His jaw was clenched so tight that a vein pulsed visibly in his temple. "I don't care what you think the rules are, old man. I make the rules here, and I say you can't do that." The confusion in Samuel's voice was heartbreaking. "Sir, I've been coming to this park for over a decade. I've never been told I couldn't feed the birds. Could you please tell me which ordinance prohibits it? I don't want to break any laws." "Shut your mouth," Mitchell snapped, stepping so close that Samuel could smell the coffee on his breath and feel the heat of his anger. "You think you know the law better than me? You people never learn your place, do you?" Those last 3 words, "you people," hung in the air like a curse. Samuel had heard them before, countless times throughout his life. In the 1960s South, in job interviews where he was turned away despite being qualified, in hospitals where he received substandard care, and in 100 small moments that reminded him that some people would never see him as fully human. Samuel's voice remained steady despite the fear growing in his chest. "I meant no disrespect, officer. I'm just an old man feeding some birds. I'll leave if you want me to." "Damn right you'll leave," Mitchell snarled. "But not before you learn some respect." Without warning, he snatched the paper bag from Samuel's lap, shaking it violently. Breadcrumbs scattered across the ground and into the fountain, floating on the surface like tiny rafts. The remaining pigeons fled in panic, their wings beating frantically as they disappeared into the safety of the trees. Samuel reached out instinctively, his hands grasping at empty air. "Please, that was all the bread I had. Those birds depend on me." Mitchell's response was swift and brutal. His open palm struck Samuel's cheek with a sharp crack that echoed across the water. The elderly man's head snapped to the side, pain exploding across his face. He nearly fell from the bench, saved only by clutching the arm rest with desperate fingers. A gasp went up from somewhere behind them. A jogger had stopped, pulling out her earbuds. A mother pushing a stroller had frozen on the path. 2 teenagers on skateboards had come to a complete halt, their mouths hanging open in shock. "Did you see that?" One of the teens whispered to his friend. "That cop just hit that old blind guy." "Get your phone out," the other replied, his voice shaking. "We need to record this." But the witnesses remained at a distance, paralyzed by the uniform, by the authority it represented, by the fear of becoming targets themselves. Their phones came out, trembling hands struggling to start recording, but none of them moved closer. None of them intervened. Mitchell leaned down until his face was inches from Samuel's. His voice dropped to a menacing whisper that somehow seemed more threatening than his earlier shouting. "You think this is your park? You think you belong here?" His words dripped with decades of racial hatred that had been festering in his heart like an infected wound. Samuel's cheek burned from the slap, but his spirit was what truly ached. "This is a public park," he said quietly, though his voice trembled with fear. "It belongs to everyone." "Not to you," Mitchell replied. "Not to people like you." The officer grabbed Samuel's thin arm and yanked him forward, nearly pulling him off the bench. The elderly man's cane clattered to the ground, rolling beyond his reach. Without it, Samuel felt completely helpless, disoriented, vulnerable in ways that went beyond his blindness. "Please," Samuel whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm 73 years old. I can't see. What harm am I doing to anyone?" Mitchell's answer came in the form of another blow, this one harder than the first. His fist connected with Samuel's jaw, splitting his lip and sending blood trickling down his chin. The old man cried out, more in shock than pain, though the physical hurt was considerable. The small crowd of witnesses grew larger, but they remained frozen in disbelief. Phones were recording now, capturing every moment of the brutality, but still no one stepped forward. The badge, the gun, the authority of the uniform, it all combined to create an invisible barrier that kept potential heroes at bay. Mitchell reached for his handcuffs, the metal glinting in the fading sunlight. "You're under arrest for disobeying a lawful order and resisting an officer." "I wasn't resisting," Samuel protested weakly, blood from his split lip making his words slurred. "I was just sitting here." "You're resisting now," Mitchell growled, twisting Samuel's frail wrist behind his back with unnecessary force. The handcuffs clicked into place with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire park. But this was only the beginning. Mitchell's hatred had found a target, and he wasn't finished. The afternoon was about to become much darker. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the park like a gunshot. Samuel Washington sat hunched forward on the bench, his thin wrists twisted painfully behind his back, blood from his split lip staining his worn shirt. The cold steel bit into his weathered skin, a cruel reminder of how quickly dignity could be stripped away. Officer Mitchell stood over his victim like a predator, savoring the hunt. The growing crowd of witnesses seemed to fuel his arrogance rather than deter it. He could see the phones recording, could hear the murmurs of shock and outrage, but in his twisted mind, this only proved his power. He was the law here. He was in control. "Look at you," Mitchell sneered, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Pathetic old fool. You thought you could just ignore what I told you." Samuel raised his head slowly, his cloudy eyes searching blindly for the source of the hatred. "I wasn't ignoring you, officer. I just didn't understand what I did wrong." "What you did wrong?" Mitchell's laugh was harsh, bitter. "You exist in my space. You dirty up my park with your presence." He grabbed Samuel's shirt collar and yanked him forward. "People like you should know better by now." The racial slur that followed was so vile, so filled with generations of hatred, that several witnesses gasped audibly. A woman in the growing crowd started crying. A man pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his hand shaking as he tried to explain what was happening. Samuel's shoulders sagged under the weight of the words. He had heard them before, too many times throughout his 73 years. But somehow hearing them in this place, his place of peace, while handcuffed and helpless, cut deeper than usual. "Why do you hate me so much?" Samuel asked softly, his voice barely audible above the fountain's gentle bubbling. "I've never hurt anyone. I just wanted to feed the birds." Mitchell's response was another vicious blow, this time with his closed fist. The punch landed squarely on Samuel's temple, sending stars exploding across his vision, ironic for a man who could no longer see. He toppled sideways, saved from falling off the bench only by Mitchell's grip on his collar. "Somebody help him," a voice called from the crowd. But the plea fell on ears paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. The badge, the gun, the uniform, they all carried the weight of authority that kept good people frozen in place. Mitchell reached for his baton, sliding it from his belt with practiced ease. The expandable metal rod gleamed menacingly as he flicked it to its full length. The sound it made, a sharp, threatening snap, caused the crowd to step back instinctively. "You want to know why I hate you?" Mitchell hissed, raising the baton above his head. "Because you think you're equal. You think you deserve the same respect as real Americans." The baton began its descent, aimed at Samuel's defenseless head. The crowd screamed in unison, phones shaking as people recorded what they were certain would be a murder. Samuel closed his sightless eyes and braced for the blow that would likely end his life. But the blow never came. A strong hand shot out of nowhere, catching Mitchell's wrist mid-swing. The baton stopped inches from Samuel's skull, held motionless by an iron grip that seemed unbreakable. "That's enough." The voice that spoke was deep, calm, and carried an authority that had nothing to do with badges or uniforms. It was the voice of a man who had faced down opponents in rings filled with thousands of screaming fans, who had stared defeat in the face and never blinked. Mitchell spun around, fury blazing in his eyes at this interruption to his power trip. Standing behind him was a tall figure in a simple hoodie and baseball cap, his face partially hidden by dark sunglasses. To most observers, he looked like just another park visitor. But there was something about his presence, something in the way he carried himself, that commanded immediate attention. "Let go of me right now," Mitchell snarled, trying to pull his wrist free. But the grip holding him was like a steel clamp. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? I'm a police officer." "I can see that," the newcomer replied, his voice steady as granite. "And I can see what you're doing too. So can everyone else here." He gestured slightly toward the crowd, where dozens of phones continued recording every moment. The crowd was beginning to buzz with recognition. Whispers started small, but grew louder as people began to realize who had just stepped into the chaos. "Is that?" "No way." "It is. That's John Cena." The name rippled through the gathering like electricity. Suddenly, the atmosphere changed completely. What had been a scene of helpless witnesses watching brutality became something else entirely. The arrival of someone willing to act. Mitchell's eyes widened as recognition dawned, but his hatred burned too hot to be cooled by celebrity status. "I don't care who you are," he spat. "You just assaulted a police officer. You're under arrest." John Cena slowly removed his sunglasses, revealing the face that had become synonymous with never giving up, never backing down. His blue eyes were hard as steel as they fixed on Mitchell's face. "The only assault I see here," Cena said quietly, "is a coward with a badge beating a defenseless old man." His grip tightened on Mitchell's wrist. "And that stops right now." Samuel, still handcuffed and bleeding, turned his head toward the new voice. Though he couldn't see his unexpected protector, something in that voice, something strong and uncompromising, gave him hope for the first time since this nightmare began. "Please," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible, "don't let him hurt anyone else." Cena's jaw tightened as he looked down at the elderly man's injuries. When he looked back at Mitchell, his expression was harder than granite. "You heard him," Cena said, his voice carrying the promise of consequences. "This ends now." But Mitchell wasn't finished. His free hand moved toward his service weapon, and the crowd held its collective breath. The confrontation was about to escalate far beyond anything anyone could have imagined. The stage was set for a battle between good and evil, with an innocent man's life hanging in the balance. The park had transformed into a powder keg ready to explode. Officer Mitchell's hand hovered dangerously close to his service weapon, while John Cena maintained his unbreakable grip on the man's wrist. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, phones recording every 10th second, their collective breath held in anticipation of what would happen next. Samuel remained hunched on the bench, handcuffed and bleeding, caught between his tormentor and his unexpected protector. Though he couldn't see the standoff unfolding above him, he could feel the electricity in the air, the weight of a moment that would define everyone involved. "You're making a huge mistake," Mitchell snarled at Cena, his voice shaking with rage and something else, fear. For the first time since this confrontation began, he wasn't completely in control. "Do you have any idea what the consequences will be for interfering with police business?" Cena's response was measured, calm, but carried the unmistakable threat of a man who had never backed down from a fight. Police business? He gestured toward Samuel with his free hand. You call beating a blind 73-year-old man police business? The crowd erupted in supportive shouts. Tell him, John. That's not police work. He's right. The energy had completely shifted. What had been a scene of helpless witnesses was now a unified front behind someone willing to stand up to injustice. Mitchell's face flushed red with humiliation and fury. The very people who had been too scared to intervene were now emboldened by Cena's presence, and their voices grew louder, more confident. His authority, his power, was crumbling before his eyes. You don't understand, Mitchell said, his voice taking on a desperate edge. People like him, they need to learn respect. They need to know their place. The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. The racist undertones that had been simmering beneath the surface were now laid bare for everyone to see and record. Several people in the crowd began shouting angrily, their outrage finally finding its voice. Cena's eyes flashed with controlled fury. His place. He stepped closer to Mitchell, his impressive frame casting a shadow over the officer. His place is sitting peacefully in a public park, feeding birds, without being terrorized by someone who swore an oath to protect and serve. Mitchell made his fatal mistake then. Frustrated by his loss of control, humiliated by the crowd's reaction, and enraged by Cena's defiance, he lunged forward with his free hand, aiming a wild punch at Cena's face. But John Cena had faced opponents far more skilled than an out-of-shape, rage-blinded police officer. He ducked the clumsy punch easily, using Mitchell's momentum against him. In one fluid motion, he twisted the officer's arm, applied pressure to a nerve point, and sent Mitchell stumbling backward. The baton clattered to the ground, rolling across the pavement and coming to rest near the fountain. The sound it made seemed to break some invisible spell that had been holding the crowd back. Get him, John, someone shouted. Take him down, called another voice. Mitchell recovered his balance and charged again, this time with both fists flying. But Cena was ready. Years of professional wrestling, countless hours of training, and an unshakable moral compass had prepared him for exactly this moment. He blocked Mitchell's wild swings with ease, his movements precise and controlled. This wasn't about showing off or entertaining a crowd. This was about protecting an innocent man who had already suffered far too much. Mitchell's attacks grew more desperate, more violent. He grabbed for his pepper spray, but Cena caught his wrist again, this time twisting it until the canister fell harmlessly to the ground. The officer tried to knee Cena in the stomach, but found himself off balance and vulnerable. It doesn't have to be this way, Cena said, his voice calm even as he defended himself. Stop this now, and we can end it here. But Mitchell was beyond reason. The hatred that had been building inside him for years had found its target, and he wouldn't stop until either he or his opponent was down. He reached for his radio, probably to call for backup, but Cena was faster. In a move that wrestling fans would recognize instantly, Cena grabbed Mitchell by the shoulders and executed a perfect takedown. The officer hit the ground hard, the air rushing out of his lungs in a whoosh that could be heard throughout the park. The crowd erupted in cheers that echoed off the surrounding trees. Yes, that's what I'm talking about. Justice. But Cena wasn't finished. With Mitchell on the ground, gasping for breath, Cena quickly moved to Samuel's side. His expression softened completely as he knelt beside the elderly man. It's okay, sir, Cena said gently, his voice a stark contrast to the authority he had used with Mitchell. You're safe now. Let me get those handcuffs off you. Samuel turned his head toward the voice, tears streaming down his bruised cheeks. Is it really over? It's over, Cena assured him, carefully examining the handcuffs. Can anyone call the real police? He called to the crowd. And an ambulance for this gentleman. Multiple people were already on their phones, calling 911, describing the situation to dispatchers. The video recordings that had captured Mitchell's brutality would now serve as evidence of both his crimes and Cena's heroic intervention. Mitchell struggled to his feet, his uniform dirty and disheveled, his authority completely shattered. He looked around at the crowd of witnesses, at the phone still recording, at Cena kneeling protectively beside his victim, and realized that his career, and possibly his freedom, was over. "This isn't finished," he said weakly, but the threat carried no weight. He was no longer the predator. He had become the prey. Cena stood slowly, placing himself between Mitchell and Samuel. His message was clear without words. "If you want to hurt this man anymore, you'll have to go through me first." In the distance, the sound of approaching sirens could be heard, growing louder by the second. Real help was coming. Justice was coming. And for the first time since this ordeal began, Samuel Washington smiled. The wail of sirens grew louder as 3 police cars converged on the park, their red and blue lights painting the evening shadows in urgent colors. The crowd that had gathered to witness the confrontation now numbered in the dozens, with even more people streaming in from nearby paths, drawn by the commotion and the spreading word that something extraordinary was happening. Samuel Washington sat on the bench, finally free from the handcuffs that had cut into his weathered wrists. John Cena remained beside him, a protective presence that seemed to radiate calm strength. The elderly man's injuries were visible, the bruised cheek, the split lip, the trembling in his hands, but his spirit appeared stronger than it had been in years. Officer Derek Mitchell stood off to the side, his uniform wrinkled and stained, his authority completely destroyed. The baton and pepper spray that had been his weapons of intimidation lay scattered on the ground like discarded toys. He looked around desperately, perhaps hoping his fellow officers would take his side, but the dozens of phone recordings had captured everything. The first officer to reach the scene was Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran known for her integrity and fairness. She took one look at the situation, the injured elderly man, the disheveled Officer Mitchell, the crowd of witnesses all pointing their phones in the same direction, and immediately understood that something serious had occurred. "What happened here?" she asked, her voice carrying the authority that Mitchell had tried to fake, but never truly possessed. Before Mitchell could speak, a dozen voices from the crowd began talking at once. "That cop beat up the old man. He used racial slurs." John Cena stopped him. "We got all on video." Sergeant Rodriguez held up her hand for silence, then walked over to Samuel. She knelt beside the bench, her voice gentle. "Sir, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Samuel nodded weakly. "He hit me several times, ma'am. I think I need to go to the hospital." "The ambulance is almost here," she assured him, then turned to face the crowd. "I need to understand exactly what happened. Who can give me a clear account?" A young woman stepped forward, her phone still recording. "I was jogging when I saw that officer." She pointed at Mitchell, attacking this elderly gentleman. He was feeding pigeons, and the officer just started beating him for no reason. Then John Cena showed up and stopped it. Cena stepped forward, his expression serious. "Officer, I witnessed this man," he indicated Mitchell, "assault this elderly gentleman without provocation. He used racial slurs, struck him multiple times, and was about to hit him with a baton when I intervened." Sergeant Rodriguez looked at Mitchell, who was growing pale as he realized the magnitude of his situation. "Officer Mitchell, what's your version of events?" Mitchell's voice was shaky, desperate. "I was responding to a disturbance. The subject was feeding pigeons in violation of park ordinances, and when I tried to enforce the law, he became combative." The crowd erupted in angry shouts. "That's a lie. We saw everything." "He's lying." One of the teenagers who had been recording stepped forward, his phone extended. "Officer, I have the whole thing on video. This dude is lying. The old man never fought back. He couldn't even see what was happening." Sergeant Rodriguez accepted the phone and watched several minutes of footage. Her expression grew darker with each passing second. When she finished, she handed the phone back and looked at Mitchell with disgust. "Officer Mitchell, you are under arrest for assault, battery, violation of civil rights under color of authority, and making false statements to a police officer." Mitchell's face went white. "You can't do this to me. I'm one of you." "No," Sergeant Rodriguez said firmly as she pulled out her handcuffs. "You're not. Officers like you are the reason good cops get a bad reputation." The sharp click of metal sounded as Mitchell's hands were cuffed behind his back, the same sound that had imprisoned Samuel just an hour earlier. The crowd cheered as Mitchell was led to a patrol car, his head hung in shame. As the car pulled away, taking the disgraced officer to face justice, an ambulance arrived to tend to Samuel's injuries. The paramedics were gentle as they examined the elderly man, cleaning his wounds and checking for more serious injuries. Throughout their ministrations, Cena remained close by, offering quiet words of encouragement. "Why did you help me?" Samuel asked as the paramedics worked. "You don't even know me." Cena's response was immediate and heartfelt, because it was the right thing to do. Because every person deserves dignity and respect, regardless of their age, race, or any other factor. And because no one should have to face hatred alone. Samuel's eyes, cloudy though they were, filled with tears. "In all my 73 years, I've faced a lot of hatred, but I've also seen moments of incredible kindness. Today, you reminded me that good people still exist." As the ambulance prepared to transport Samuel to the hospital for a thorough examination, the crowd began to disperse. But not before dozens of people approached Cena to shake his hand, to thank him for his courage, to tell him he was a real hero. The teenagers who had recorded the incident were already uploading their videos to social media, where they would be shared millions of times. News crews were arriving, having heard reports of the incident. The story would dominate news cycles for days, sparking conversations about police brutality, racial injustice, and the power of individuals to stand up for what's right. But for Cena, the most important moment came when Samuel, from his stretcher in the ambulance, reached out his hand. Cena took it gently, feeling the strength in those weathered fingers. "You gave me back my dignity," Samuel whispered. "How can I ever repay you?" Cena squeezed his hand gently. "You already have, sir. You reminded me why it's important to never give up, never back down when something is wrong." As the ambulance pulled away, taking Samuel to receive the medical care he needed, Cena stood in the gathering darkness of the park. The fountain continued its gentle bubbling, and a few brave pigeons had returned, pecking at the breadcrumbs that still littered the ground. Tomorrow, Samuel would return to this bench. He would bring bread for his feathered friends, just as he had for years. But now he would sit here not as a victim, but as a survivor. Not as someone invisible, but as someone who had been seen, protected, and valued. And Officer Derek Mitchell would face trial, stripped of his badge and his freedom, a cautionary tale about the consequences of hatred and abuse of power. The park had returned to peace, but it was a different kind of peace now. One earned through courage, defended through action, and preserved through the knowledge that sometimes heroes really do exist. Justice had been served, dignity had been restored, and an elderly man could feed his pigeons without fear.